I'm gonna tell you how to make the best video game of all time, and why yours is terrible, and why you should listen to mine. Okay, we're not actually talking about that. We are going to talk about how to make your game better. Doesn't mean it's not necessarily in a good state already, could be in a really bad state. But every game can still follow this rule to make it go from that 7 or 6 out of 10 to that 9 or 10 out of 10. Now it all comes down to one secret word. It's just criticism. In my opinion, criticism is genuinely the best thing that your game can get. To getting better, to being more enjoyable for a larger audience. Now, why is criticism such an important term? It's a good way to see other people's thoughts and their opinions on whatever you've created. When you make something by yourself, you only have your own perspective to go on. If you create something and make a part of it that you think is genuinely good, but you don't know how other people are going to take it, maybe they see it a different way. Maybe they think it's better or worse than what you think. That's why getting other people's perspectives is very important if you want to appeal to a large audience. We tend to always think of criticism as being this really bad thing, and oh no, they're going to criticize me, that's not good. And some people always have that perspective, but in the word itself, it doesn't mean saying bad things about something. Sure, that tends to happen. We tend to point out the flaws, because usually that's easier a lot of the time. But it just means being critical, getting deep into what kind of things you would enjoy, maybe not so much enjoy. And in that regard, criticism is a great way to see what things in your game don't work and what things do work. They can be positive things. But how do we get criticism like this? Well, in my opinion, you can also take the advice in this video on how to give criticism as well as receive it. I'm going to give you some examples from my own personal experience on some criticisms I've received and how I applied them. For context, I made a prototype called Mysterious Mystery. It was a murder mystery game where you went around, collected evidence, and then used that evidence to try to figure out what actually happened. Now remember, before we say anything, criticism is always usually an opinion at the end of the day. So it's really hard to say whether something's completely 100% bad or completely 100% good. Though I do think there are some guidelines you can use to kind of determine whether it's something you want to take or not. Let's start out with something funny, in my case, my own bad critics. I told you what my game was about so that you could understand why I feel some of these criticisms may not be so justified. For example, the first one I received was, you should make your game an open world game. Now I do think this comment was funny considering the modern take on open world games. Why is this considered bad criticism? Well, we need to look at what the game genre is. Mysterious Mystery was designed with being a story in a set location with a set premise with a set murder. Now, maybe if it was a different type of game, where it was an open area, and then you went around and saw different mysteries. Now, that could be a fun game in and of itself, but then I would lose the original purpose of what my game was supposed to be. So that's the first tool. Does it remove from what your game was intended to be? Now, this isn't always necessarily meaning the criticism itself is bad. Maybe you had a bad idea. Okay, but more seriously, maybe there was something about it that you might need to change, or else your game may not be enjoyable. Another exaggerated example of this would be if I was to say a game like Mario needed to have realistic ragdoll physics. Now that could be funny, but I feel like you'd lose the intended purpose of a Mario game. Now, this may not be bad criticism, but criticism you may not want to take in hand fully is criticism that comes from a small amount of people. I'll give you a good example. This actually is something where I got good criticism as well. I had voice acting in my game to kind of make it stand out a bit and give a bit more of an enjoyable experience. Plus, I enjoy voice directing in general, so it was fun for me.
But listen, you gotta hold up your side of the deal when you can't find any holes.
A lot of people, meaning the majority of people who played my game, had a comment about voice acting. That comment usually being how it enhanced their gameplay experience. This also makes sense to me, so I figured, hey, if I make a full game of this, I would keep that, since most people liked it. However, I did get the adverse, with some people saying that they thought it actually ruined or hindered the game experience. And now this one's interesting because it can be for a few different reasons. It might be the cast choice, maybe certain characters didn't sound like they should have, maybe it was the actual quality of the actors, maybe it was the voice direction. It also could be they just flat out don't enjoy voice acting, which funny enough, from the 1 or 2 people who said it, that was what it was. It was flat out they just didn't enjoy voice acting in video games. So to accommodate, I would make a feature that would allow them to turn off the voice acting rather than just get rid of it entirely, since most people would want it to return. Thankfully, that's an example of something where the adverse doesn't necessarily have to change the entire game or how a certain gameplay system works. Now, not all bad criticism is really easy to identify. It's not always, oh, you're making a platformer, then you should add a first-person shooter element. Because obviously something like that's an easy no-no. Some things are a bit harder to identify because they can sound like good criticism. One comment I got from only one person, but I got it from them multiple times, was my game should have multiple routes, different alternative paths you can take, maybe leading to multiple endings as well. Basically being more of a choose-your-adventure type story rather than a set story. Now, this criticism isn't bad on its own. Now remember, not all bad or negative criticism comes from a bad place. A lot of the times it's just trying to help you and not maybe knowing how to help you. In this case, it was someone not understanding how I wanted Mysterious Mystery to work, which is understandable. I'm the one who made it after all. It's something I did take into consideration, but overall, I think that as a mystery game, it works better as a set story because then that way it's not as confusing. And it makes more sense since there's only one way the story can happen. And there's a certain story I want to tell, so I make sure that every single person can see that said story. Now, I talked about the bad for quite a while, but let's talk about some really good criticism examples. These can be negative or positive, of course, and in my case, I had quite a few. Now, how do we even know if this criticism is good? Well, there's a few key factors I like to use to determine whether I think it's something that I should apply. These being, the first and most straightforward is majority of people will say it. I don't think this one needs much explanation, thankfully. It's just a lot of people say it, so, you just kind of have to go with your gut on that one. Now remember, just because it is a majority doesn't necessarily mean it's good. That's why we have these other key factors as well. Something else that's really big is if it genuinely relates to your game. This one's not so simple, but the best way I can describe it is in my previous example where I talked about someone saying your game should be open world. This inherently does not relate to my game. It's a feature that is not in my game that would also change the entire identity of the game, and it's also not in the binds of what I want the game to be. It's actually really easy to have criticism relate to a game. I'll give you a good example. Voice acting in my case, art, music, the actual gameplay rather than theoreticals. Theoreticals aren't bad, but again, it's something you may need to consider with the other elements. I hope those were decent examples of why I think criticism matters. I think my games are better off for it. Now, better is a subjective term, and it can mean something different to different people, but for me, it's more people enjoying it. If more people are overall enjoying it, then it's a better experience in my opinion. Because if it was just for me, what am I going to do? I guess I could just give myself a pat on the back and be like, hey Walker, you're pretty decent at writing, or your art's pretty okay. But that wouldn't make me happy. I want other people to enjoy what I make. That's what makes me happy, and the more people who enjoy it, well then that's a better experience overall, no? AKA, just use your common sense. I personally believe everyone watching this, if you already clicked on the video and you're here this long, you're already pretty smart. But no, jokes aside, I seriously do have hope and think that most people who watch this will have a good idea of what is good and bad criticism. Honestly, I'll tell you what, the biggest thing you can do to really mess up your stuff is by not taking any at all. By rejecting it, by criticizing or insulting those who try to help you. In general, being negative towards criticism openly is a very bad move, and it'll make you not only look entitled, but it might make you look like you don't know what you're doing. It can lead down a really bad road, and remember, no one is ever fully correct. It's not even you, so don't act like you're the bigger person in the whole thing. You're gonna know your game better than anyone else, but don't act like other people's opinions are better than yours. I say this one at the end, and I consider it very important because I've seen other developers who follow this path and make themselves look like entitled buttholes. But enough about that sort of stuff. On a positive end, I've talked enough about criticism that you'd probably have enough nickels to afford maybe a soda. But seriously, if you got it to the end, thank you so much for watching. Check out my other stuff, and if you liked it, subscribe. I plan on making more of these videos in the future. Let me know what kind of stuff you'd like me to talk about too. I'm always interested in that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.